Okay, so hey guys, and welcome back to another Axel 72 video, and in today's video I'm going to be giving my prediction for the Cory Sandhagen versus Deiveson Figueiredo fight. And so if you are new around here and you haven't yet subscribed, please do so, like the video if you do indeed like the video, and let's get straight into this. So this is an entertaining fight night main event. Deiveson Figueiredo and Cory Sandhagen are very much used to both going the 5 round distance, and so I'm sure this fight is most likely going to be a fight that has the makings to go at least into the later rounds. And it's also a fight in which it's two guys, like I say, who have a lot of experience, and they're two high level guys who are maybe teetering on the kind of cusp of getting a title shot, but are both coming off defeats, so maybe are just that little bit further away. So the winner of this, it will be tricky for them to be able to find a route back into, aiming to get into a number one contender spot. But even though this is a fourth versus fifth matchup, I don't think it means that one of these can go on to fight for the title afterwards. A lot of fighters at the moment are fighting in the rankings, and then even if they are 9th, 10th, 11th in the rankings, they're calling for title shots already, and it doesn't make sense. Of course, MMA maths doesn't make sense, and it never realistically has, and the rankings don't really mean a crazy amount. But for a fight like this, I think it's two guys that know that they aren't quite at the level for fighting for a title yet, but they are both still able to fight at a high level. I mean, somebody like a Cory Sandhagen was on a good run, probably one of the better runs in his whole career, before the Umar fights. And he was putting in good performances. He'd come off a good victory versus Rob Font before the Umar fight, where he showcased that he can wrestle well. He was getting the double leg takedowns, he was controlling with a lot of ground control time, and he was having success. It wasn't anything too crazy, but he was having success, and inevitably made him win the fight convincingly. And when he fought Umar, it was a high pace contest in which Umar always sets that high pace, and can, for the most part, maybe it's not a Marab pace, but it's still a very high pace, and Cory was able to match it. He didn't find himself out wrestled realistically at any point. He was, getting taken down to the ground, but his scrambles were looking good. Yes, he maybe wasn't able to get off the best of offense and, the attacking kind of wrestling that perhaps he might wanted to have shown, or the striking ability in which he does have with, great flying knees and other strikes in which he has. But for the most part, he was able to still hold his own against somebody like an Umar who, at the time, of course, was undefeated, and he was looking indestructible. And like I say, he was setting such a high pace and was aiming to do something in which, we know that Cory Sandhagen in the past hasn't been known for, in just continuous wrestling. He was also throwing in takedowns in which were, multiple different styles of takedowns, unique takedowns, and Cory was able to stay in there and was able to still, like I say, have success at times. And, like I say, it was a convincing win for Umar, but it wasn't a fight in which Cory's stock kind of declined too much, because, like I say, he took a guy who, like I mentioned, was unbeaten at the time, and was willing to give him the challenge, and was willing to let him step into the realm of a title contention, number one contenders type of fight. And inevitably, of course, it led on for him to fight Marab. And nobody, like I say, none of the contenders were really looking at that fight and thinking it's a favourable matchup, because there really wasn't much to gain for somebody like a Sandhagen realistically. And it was always going to be a very, very tough matchup, of course, against the Nurmagomedov, with, like I say, the tough style in which they always bring. It was always going to be very difficult, and inevitably, like I say, his stock has risen from that fight, in my opinion, and I think he still has got a lot left to give to the sport. Similarly to Deiveson Figueiredo, he came in to the bantamweight division, of course, off the back of the quartet of fights against Brandon Moreno, in which, of course, things didn't necessarily go his way for the most part of them 4 fights. But when he came into the bantamweight scene, he was, he's on the older side. He's 37 years of age now, and people were thinking that perhaps this resurgence in his career wasn't realistically possible, and he couldn't really get himself into the best of conditions just from going, or the best of rankings just from going through contenders. Full credit to him for going through contenders. We see somebody like a and Ilia Topuria at the moment. He's moved up into the lightweight division and he's really trying to just force himself into the title fight. Of course, he's coming off two great knockouts. Figueiredo wasn't quite coming off that kind of a run, but Figueiredo could have still used his previous flyweight title, reign as leverage to push him into more, maybe a number one contenders fight straight away, or even a title shot early on in that run in the bantamweight division. But instead, he's gone his own route as well. He's gone through the ranked contenders, and he, almost got there with. Of course, he had to beat Jan and then probably would have got a title shot. But obviously, he didn't beat Jan. It was a tough, well fought contest where Figueiredo came on good late, had good striking combinations that he was putting together late, and was unfortunate to not be able to get the win. But inevitably, Jan's striking did look better, especially in the kind of mid rounds as well. And so he held his own as well. He was able to get some takedowns at times. It wasn't anything too crazy, but inevitably, like I say, he was able to hold his own. The negatives I think about from that Deiveson Figueiredo fight for against Jan was the fact that he was getting outstrengthed a bit. It seemed like whenever he was trying to get a takedown on Jan was able to get up and was able to, pretty much not have too much of a problem just going back to what he was doing. Inevitably, that led on to, like I say, him continuously failing most kind of takedowns and not really getting too much control time, which meant that Jan was able to gain confidence, and that was probably the thing in which Jan needed the most in that fight, to gain confidence after the run that he'd been on previous. And so that's, with the fact that he is, of course, on paper the smaller guy, and also the fact he's on the older side of things, that's going to lean into Cory Sandhagen, of course, being the favourite for this fight. I do believe that Cory Sandhagen will win via unanimous decision. I think, like I say, Figueiredo's striking ability isn't bad, and like I say, he was able to showcase that well in the latter part of the Jan fight. But I think Sandhagen, if he can get to his confident striking, then he can have success. And if he can mix in the wrestling, in which he's now showcased that he can utilize at a high level, then I think that's a very well-rounded Cory Sandhagen, in which he causes most people in the division problems. Maybe not Merab, because Merab's style perhaps still might not favour him, but I think he's still got something, like I say, left to give in the division, and I think there are guys in which perhaps in rematches he might be able to have success against. And like I say, I don't think he's going to be out there and able to get a stoppage, because Figueiredo, of course, is a very tough guy himself, and it will take a big statement for him to be able to get a stoppage. But I do think he's going to be able to have success and, like I say, use his more well-rounded mixed martial arts skills, in which he's honed in on more recently, to be able to have success. And I think possibly, depending on how convincing of a victory Sandhagen has in this fight, Figueiredo could even retire. That, is a bold shout, and I do think Figueiredo can still beat, certain fighters in the bantamweight division, but does he realistically, like I say, from the title reign he had at flyweight, if he knows that he's not going to be able to get a title shot, or not for like a long time, and he's not even going to get top contender matchups anymore, does he see a point in going and dropping down a level again? Because when you drop down a level in the bantamweight division, you're no longer fighting a Sandhagen or a Jan, or even an O'Malley, or Yadong again, I suppose, them type of fighters. Instead, you're fighting something like a Bautista, or maybe a Cheetah Vera again, perhaps. Like I said, there's not really too many excellent matchups there for you, and so I just don't necessarily think that that would appeal to Deiveson Figueiredo, unless perhaps something like a Henry Cejudo might be willing to give Deiveson Figueiredo a chance. It seems like he's not ready to hang up the gloves yet, so perhaps that fight could happen. But I do believe, like I say, Sandhagen's going to be able to outwill him and outpace him into a unanimous decision victory. Then who he can go on to fight next? Names I've just mentioned. Jan again. Jan is in a very good spot to get a rematch with Dvalishvili, but Dvalishvili is of course going to be fighting O'Malley first, and then he might rematch Nurmagomedov. So we could see him go on to fight Jan next, perhaps. Or Yadong again. Of course, Yadong lost via stoppage. I think it was a doctor stoppage against Sandhagen, but he was coming off a performance against Cejudo, in which I probably would like to see the rematch with. But he didn't look awful in that fight, so maybe that could happen. Or the winner of Vera versus Bautista. A name's there. Perhaps if Bautista wins in nice fashion, that could make for a new contender in the bantamweight scene. But I think there's a lot of fighters, like I say there, that can just kind of go round in the same kind of pool of just fighting the same fights over and over again. It's just not really what we want to see, because like I say, Sandhagen isn't going to get a title shot most likely unless he comes in as a late replacement after this. So he's not going to get an O'Malley fight. And if O'Malley loses against Dvalishvili, we might not see him for a while. He's not going to get an Nurmagomedov rematch, because I'm sure Nurmagomedov's going to wait around for the winner of the title fight. So, there's not really much else that you can really do other than fight somebody who's already fought. So it wouldn't surprise me if one of them matchups do end up happening. Another fight in which I did want to quickly touch upon and give my prediction for on this card. It's a good fight night card. I'm really excited to see Jeremy Stephens back as well. He's always entertaining, and he's coming off a good run in BKFC, so he's been given another chance in the UFC. But that's not the fight in which I want to talk about. Reinier Deiveson is fighting Bo Nickal, and I think as a middleweight fight, that's an excellent fight, and I think it's a tough matchup for both fighters. Deiveson is, of course, ranked 13th, and Bo Nickal is currently unranked, so this is the opportunity for Bo to get into the ranking position. Bo has been progressed quickly and has been put on high levels, straight away, and been put in front of masses amounts of people straight away. He's been high up on cards from the get-go in his UFC kind of run, to be honest. And he's on UFC 300. He was, I believe, co-main on the Jones Miocic card, and that performance against Paul Craig wasn't really an excellent performance. He showcased that he can strike and can perhaps hurt a little bit, but it was very limited striking, and you could see what he was doing, and there really wasn't too much control or technique in it. And so is he going to go back to his roots of wrestling again? Perhaps, but Deiveson is a wrestler, and he's proven that by, of course, his one championship days where he had a lot of success and was, of course, champion. But then, he went and submitted Mearshart in a performance in which wasn't the best. This could be a stand-up contest, which could be a slugfest, because neither of these guys are the best when they are striking, and if they are wanting to be the macho guys, and they might be wanting to strike. But again, like I say, I don't think that is a good idea for neither of them to really showcase their best of skills, and I don't think that's going to get the fans more excited for either of them. But Deiveson went after that performance, which was, not the most exciting for a new guy coming into the UFC, to then fight Kevin Holland, in which he submitted him within round one relatively easily, took him down to the ground, got onto his back nicely, and got him submitted pretty comfortably. And so that was, a showcasing of his wrestling ability. I feel like from that performance against Mearshart, the UFC knew that perhaps we're not going to get a megastar in Deiveson, and that's maybe why he's giving him somebody like a Bo Nickal, because he's going to have to work hard, Deiveson, if he's really going to showcase that he deserves to be in the UFC. And Bo Nickal is needing a tough test, and it's going to be a tough test for sure, and he's giving him a chance, like I say, to finally get into the rankings. Who do I think is going to win? I think it's going to be a very interesting fight to see and to play out. I would like to think that Bo Nickal is going to be able to win via submission in round 2. If he goes to his grappling game, like I say, I think he is superior wrestling-wise to Deiveson. Deiveson, like I say, isn't a bad wrestler either. Plus, he's huge for the middleweight division, realistically. And so, again, like I say, this could be an upset in the making here. It would not surprise me if Bo Nickal did lose this fight, but I do think he is going to be able to get the submission. I would like to see him use his best skills in, in the ground wrestling game. I think from the fact that fans were calling him overrated and were really slandering him in that last performance, I think he's going to come into this fight, of course, with something to prove. And I think he's going to be able to prove that. And, like I say, submit him in round 2. He's going to have to be wary of Deiveson throughout the whole fight, even on the ground. And like I say, I think it is going to be a bit of a different test, but it might bring him back to the old kind of wrestling days, which he was used to in the past, where he was wrestling, I'm sure, all types of people, and it was able to have success. And I think he will channel into his roots, and he will be able to get, like I say, that submission in round 2. Then who he goes on to fight next? I think it's an interesting one. Of course, he needs to, in my opinion, have a couple fights in the ranking system before he gets anywhere near thinking about a title shot. So I think somebody who's coming off a loss would be a good idea. That being, if you look around, Paulo Costa could be a good fight. He's tested some top guys, but not always come out on top. Brendan Allen is still ranked well, but he's coming off that loss versus Hernandez, which wasn't the worst of performances. So that could be a good fight. Vittori is coming off a loss to Delidze, so that again could be another good contest there. All three of them guys, because they're coming off losses, quite often you see them realistically only get matchups against guys who are coming up because the UFC aren't gonna, like I say, push them anymore. They basically owe the UFC at least the chance for an uppercomer to come and replace them. So like I say, one of them matchups I feel like would make sense. And again, like I say, I feel like Bo Nickal, there needs to be a bit less of a rush with him, especially when he gets into the rankings. I don't think we need to continuously progress him so quickly. Let him have chance to learn. He was learning in that last fight, and he showed that he clearly does need to develop his striking. So let him have chance to do that, like they've kind of done with Paddy a bit, and he's getting there with his striking. It is improving, and like I say, let him progress, and we can see him in a title shot when he's ready. Don't force it, don't push it, give him time that he needs. But yeah, that is it for today's video. Hope you did enjoy. Like the video if you did, need like the video, subscribe if you're new, and thanks for watching.